As you've seen a few times in our service already this morning, this is the second Sunday of Advent. Traditionally, Advent is celebrated on the 4 Sundays leading up to Christmas. Last week, we had a guest preacher, Warren Martin was his name, and he pointed us to Isaiah 11, 1 through 16, and helped us see how we can wait in hope. This week, I want to point us to another passage in the same book, also in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 9, verses 1 through 7. Isaiah chapter 9, verses 1 through 7. In the 3 remaining Sundays of Advent, counting this one, I'm going to do a 3-part Advent preaching series. The promise, the arrival, and the response. So this morning we'll be focusing on the promise. And again, our passage will be Isaiah chapter 9, verses 1 through 7. If you don't have a Bible with you, by the way, you can find a black pew Bible in the back of the pew in front of you. And Isaiah 9, 1 through 7 can be found on page 573. Maybe some of you have heard the story of the famous Christmas truce of 1914 during World War I. On Christmas Eve 1914, British and German soldiers were facing each other in trenches. But something amazing happened. Soldiers, both German and British, started to sing the Christmas carol Silent Night, and eventually they got out of their trenches, crossed no man's land, and they started to shake hands, they exchanged gifts, and some of them even played games of soccer together. This was entirely spontaneous, and honestly, it would be hard to believe. It sounds like a made-up story, but there are so many first-hand accounts of soldiers during World War I who actually participated in this from both sides that it has to have happened. It's an unbelievable story. In a powerful way, that story represents that the message of Christmas is so powerful and so true that it can bring joy and light even in the darkest circumstances. Isaiah 9, 1 through 7 contains some of the promises of Christmas. And just like it did in 1914, it's a message that can bring light into darkness today. And that's why I want to focus on it this morning. Now, before I read this passage, I do want you to know something. You have to understand something about the historical context of Isaiah if you want to understand this passage. And here's why. At the time of Isaiah, who was a prophet, the people of God had been disobeying God for hundreds of years. They had rejected him and worshiped other gods, and they did it over and over and over again. And God had sent prophet after prophet after prophet, but they rejected them and refused to change their ways. So God was patient with his people, but eventually God brought foreign nations like Assyria and Babylon, some of the greatest empires of the ancient world, and these foreign nations conquered the people of God and led them into exile as punishment for their sin. If you're in an adult Sunday school class here at First Southern, you might have started a study of Daniel and Ezekiel this morning, and those were 2 people who actually lived through these events as well. So, you have to understand that the promise that Isaiah is making is in the context of that reality. God is going to judge his people because of their sin. And that brings us to Isaiah chapter 9, again, beginning in verse 1. Will you stand for the reading of the Word of God? Isaiah chapter 9, beginning in verse 1. But there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. In the former time, he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time, he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. You have multiplied the nation. You have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as they are glad when they divide the spoil. For the yoke of his burden and the staff for his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken as on the day of Midian. For every boot of the trampling warrior in battle tumult and every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. You may be seated. Isaiah 9, 1 through 7 is a beautiful passage. I've honestly struggled this week with how to articulate its beauty. It's like standing in front of the Mona Lisa and trying to explain to somebody why it's beautiful. Isaiah 9, 1 through 7 just is beautiful. When it's read, it's lovely and filled with hope and joy. But I think we can focus on 5 aspects of this promise in our time this morning. And I think these 5 aspects of this promise will help us understand why this was not just a promise for people who lived about 700 years ago, but it's also a promise for us today. First, I want to show you in this passage a promise of light. A promise of light. At this time of year, the nights are long and the days are short, aren't they? But the further north that somebody is, the shorter the days get. The shortest day of the year in Fairbanks, Alaska, the winter solstice, only gives 3 hours and 42 minutes of sunlight. Now, Barrow, Alaska, which is on the far north coast of Alaska, is even more extreme. During the winter in Barrow, Alaska, there are 67 days of uninterrupted darkness. Now, I don't mean any disrespect